Hello and welcome to my Cindered Shadows review. In this review, I'll go over what I think of the story, world building, characters, mechanics, and level design of the DLC campaign before rendering my final verdict on the overall experience. Before I begin, please note that I make no effort to avoid spoilers in this review. The idea of an underground city is compelling, but in context it seems hard to buy into. Even before the DLC was released, I was skeptical of the existence of a hidden city below Garreg Mach that the church either didn't know about or decided to tolerate. Having played Cindered Shadows, I'm no more convinced than I was going in. Here are some of the questions I have about Abyss. Garreg Mach itself is already a refuge for the unwanted, persecuted, and downtrodden. Examples include Catherine, Cyril, and the refugees of Remire Village. Why can the inhabitants of Abyss not also live in Garreg Mach? How can the existence of Abyss be kept secret from the general populace of Garreg Mach if people like Alois and NPC priests know about it? If it's not a secret, and it can be raided by armies of bandits and mercenaries, how is it effective in protecting its inhabitants from whatever they're hiding from? This is exacerbated by the distrust between the Abyssians on one hand and the Church and Knights of Seiros on the other. For that matter, given the Church's negative attitude toward Abyss, why take refuge right beneath it in the first place? Why not go somewhere else? The initial exploration of Abyss is compelling in much the same way that the idea of an underground city is compelling. Aesthetically, it's quite different from anything else in Garreg Mach, and it hints at a much more expansive area than what you can initially access. Unfortunately, Abyss never opens up into something more expansive, and quickly reveals itself to be quite small. Similarly, the initial promise of new secrets and lore to uncover goes unfulfilled. The library in particular being just a cool-looking room for a few characters to stand in seems like a big missed opportunity. There are also some things that don't seem to have any payoff, like the Mysterious Woman and the Wayseer's room, though I do wonder whether these can be explored further in the main game. I do like having more well-defined NPCs during the exploration phase. It's a small thing, but getting to know these characters just a bit makes their dialogue feel more substantive compared to the majority of Garreg Mach NPCs. This is one of the reasons that Gatekeeper is so popular, and while none of the Abyssian NPCs rise to that level, they're certainly more memorable than most of their Garreg Mach counterparts. The story itself is pretty standard Fire Emblem fare. A bad person wants a powerful ancient MacGuffin to do a bad thing with, and our heroes must stop them. Also, there's a dragon at the end. It doesn't add much of substance to the overall story or lore of Three Houses, and can be contradictory with the main story at times in minor ways. However, it does at least establish that Rhea has been actively trying to resurrect Sothis for a long time, using multiple approaches, which I appreciate. Before getting into characters individually, I want to note that I think that locking the Ashen Wolves supports to the main game is a major design flaw. I don't know how many people plan to do another playthrough just for the sake of getting those supports, but the idea certainly doesn't appeal to me, to say nothing of the fact that it might be difficult or impossible to get all of their supports in a single playthrough. I expect some players will feel cheated out of that content if they've already finished everything they intend to do with the main game, though I suppose there's always the option to watch the supports on YouTube. In any case, my thoughts on the characters in Cindered Shadows are informed only by what I know from the campaign itself and the pre-existing context from the main game, and I would argue that these things ought to be enough to stand up on their own. Balthus is a fun character. I expected him to be pretty similar to Raphael, but he's very much his own man. He's not the most complex or interesting character, but he establishes himself well in relatively little screen time. And because I'm easily amused, I enjoy his context-dependent epithets. It's too bad that there's no Holst for him to support, but perhaps his supports with Hilda cover that ground. As a unit, Balthus is underwhelming. His biggest strength is that his class has 6 movement with reduced terrain penalties, but he badly needs Death Blow or increased healing output to make him more relevant. Given his visual design and his dialogue, I certainly expected more damage output from him. It seems highly likely that IS did not design Balthus and the War Monk class with each other in mind, and in the main game he would fit much more naturally into the standard Brawler, Grappler, War Master class line. I could see his personal skill being useful, especially combined with Vantage, but it's not a good fit for my playstyle. In my opinion, Happy doesn't bring much to the table. In advance of release, she was described as apathetic and nihilistic, which didn't sound encouraging to me, but the reality isn't even that well defined. She does generally come across as bored, but she cares enough about what's going on that it undercuts the notion that she's apathetic or nihilistic, so I'm not really sure what IS was going for with her. Her Psi ability, while interesting, is frustratingly underexplained. As a unit, Happy is an exercise in disappointment. A mounted unit with built-in magic range +1 sounds great, but she only has 6 movement and spends a good chunk of the campaign too slow to double armored units. Nor does she have the damage output to one-shot anything. Her crest is rendered useless by her lack of faith magic, and her personal skill does very little due to the low might of her tones. Enemy Valkyries are also very slow in Cindered Shadows, which suggests that Happy might be held back by her class to some extent, and might work better in a different magic-focused class. Constance is another character who benefits from how easily amused I am. Her sunlight tick isn't explained either, but explaining it doesn't seem nearly as important, and while it's basic Jekyll and Hyde stuff, it definitely made me laugh. During my playthrough, I complained about her motivation to restore her house to its former glory, but the only issue I had was that the game seemed to think we should be especially moved by her plight. I think the motivation works well for her as a character, and I think that giving characters that kind of motivation does a lot to help flesh them out. I do think her presence in Abyss is a bit incongruous, however. She doesn't seem like the kind of person to accept the need to live underground, though her sunlight tick might have a lot to do with it. As a unit, Constance is unsurprisingly great. 7 movement and flight with magic is fantastic, and she also has bolting, which I, as an inveterate hoarder, barely made use of, but I'm well aware that I should have. Of the Ashen Wolves, she seems by far to be the best fit mechanically for her DLC class, and I'd expect her to want to stick with it in the main game, though ideally she'd want to pick up Fiendish Blow along the way. Her personal skill is always useful, although far better on indoor maps given her disposition toward offense. Given her lack of the Black Magic ×2 skill, her crest is very helpful for keeping her in the fight during the long chapters of Cindered Shadows, to say nothing of the value of having it proc on bolting. Everyone loves Claude, but in some ways, Yuri is, dare I say it, a better version of him. For one thing, he's actually bisexual, whereas Claude merely misleads everyone into believing he's bisexual. Snark aside, Yuri is a schemer like Claude, but he's both less in-your-face about it and more successful at it. One of my biggest critiques of Verdant Wind is that there's so little payoff to Claude the schemer, but Yuri doesn't have that problem. He manages the competing interests of the Church, Elfric, and Abyss quite adeptly, though I'm not convinced he needed to allow Elfric to get as far as he did. Given that the hostages he wants to protect are critical to his motivation, I'd have liked to see something more fleshed out than the abstract description of them that we got. As a unit, Yuri isn't the most powerful, but he makes up for that by being flexible and fun to use. With Holy Knight being not only a master class, but probably the worst of them, healing with Canto is quite rare in Three Houses, which makes Yuri feel unique, especially as a foot unit. Combined with foul play and reduced terrain penalties, his mobility is quite good, though this undersells the utility of foul play in a campaign with no dancer and no other movement or positioning skills, spells, or gambits of any kind. Yuri's healing is also much better than Balthus's, despite a similarly poor magic stat thanks to his access to recover. And while his damage output isn't fantastic, he has good all-around defenses and avoid, making him a reliable frontline combatant, especially since his good mobility makes it relatively easy to place him in favorable terrain after attacking. Of course, I should caveat here that I am aware that Fetters of Dromi isn't locked to Yuri, and giving it to another character would dramatically reduce his effectiveness. For what it's worth, in my opinion, the only other serious candidate for it in Cindered Shadows is Byleth, and I do think Yuri is the best choice due to foul play. I won't go through each Academy student at length here, just some quick hits. But before I do that, I also want to note that I think the lack of any new supports between the 6 students is another missed opportunity. Obviously, the length of the campaign would require limiting these to just a single C support. But even so, I don't think I'm the only one who'd be excited to see supports between the house leaders. Edelgard's role in the story is to interact with Constance, but to me the most interesting thing was her conversation with Dimitri. Perhaps her forgetfulness would be less surprising if I'd already finished Azure Moon. I'm very glad I switched her to warrior. Claude should be best buds with Yuri. He has a few funny lines, but I think they could have done more with him. His damage output is sorry without death blow. I probably should have given him an axe to take advantage of axe fare. As far as I can tell, Dimitri is only present so you can use all three lords together. As if that's exciting and not just old news. It was the first thing I did in Three Houses in the prologue. You can't fool me, IS. Ha! Anyway, I'm glad he's here because he's the best unit in Cindered Shadows. Hilda is obviously here to talk to Balti. Their inability to recognize each other initially is ridiculous. I love Hilda as a character, but I have to admit that given the clear goal of building a diverse squad, she feels pretty redundant with Edelgard as another axe infantry unit, though I'm not sure what would make a good alternative. While Ash's backstory has a lot of similarities to Yuri's, this is only touched on briefly at the end, and I suspect he's mostly here because he has Lock Touch. Even taking hit plus 20 into account, his long-range hit rates with Deadeye are surprisingly good. Linhardt is here because he's the student most likely to know something about the Apostles. As much as I find her character to be pretty boring and her voice acting cringy, I would gladly trade him for Mercedes with Fortify, or he could have just had Warp. There's some character development for Rhea in Cindered Shadows, which to me continues to reinforce the idea that much of what's wrong in Fodlan is a consequence of Rhea's hubris. It's unfortunate that we don't get a clearer explanation of what Rhea was up to with Citri, but on the other hand, what we do get is already at odds with this campaign's timing within the main game. As I mentioned during my playthrough, Seth's absence from Cindered Shadows is peculiar. I can't recall any times during the main game when Rhea interacts with Alois without Seth around, much less generic NPC clergy. I actually think having Rhea interact with a more diverse group of church officials helps the world feel larger and more populated, but it's still jarring not seeing Seth with her. My best guess for his absence remains something to do with his voice actor. In my opinion, in the main game, Byleth is an anchor that drags down what would otherwise be a better story without their presence. I was thus happy with the initial direction Cindered Shadows took, in which Byleth seems to be a competent leader who could help other people with their troubles. Unfortunately, everything must be about Byleth, and eventually we learn that the entire plot centers around Byleth's dead mom. Byleth, empty husk that they are, seemingly has no reaction to or concern about any of this, which contributes to the tie-in feeling rather underwhelming. And while we do learn a bit more about Byleth's backstory and Rhea's involvement in it, building the entire campaign around that seems unnecessary. As a unit, Byleth suffers from perhaps the biggest downgrade from the main game, losing not only class flexibility, but also the massive charm bonus from regular tea parties. This doesn't prevent Byleth from being one of the best units in Cindered Shadows, however, thanks to excellent overall stats and access to a potent 1-2 range option. I want to give a special shout out to Melody and the Death Knight for putting in such random appearances. Like several other things about this campaign, these two showing up seems like a case of trying to tie too many things together and making the world as a whole seem smaller as a result. I don't want to go into inordinate detail on all the little problems with their inclusion, but suffice it to say that it would have been better to introduce a couple of one-off mini-bosses instead. Elfric isn't the worst villain in Fire Emblem, but for me, he's not particularly compelling or believable. His creepy, unhealthy obsession with Citri reminds me of Severus Snape's obsession with Lily Potter, but he takes it to another level, well past the point of what I think an otherwise mentally healthy person would do. Before his discovery of Citri's body, he appears to have been not just a functional individual capable of achieving the highest attainable rank in the Church, but also a kind and caring person. As such, it's hard to understand why this discovery would have been enough to make him go off the deep end. I would find his motivation a lot more believable if Citri had been his wife, a la Batman's Mr. Freeze or Orson from Sacred Stones. And this is where the need to make everything about Byleth rears its ugly head again. Were Citri not Byleth's mother, then she could have been Elfric's wife, but unfortunately for him and for the narrative, Geralt is in the way. Here's another interesting option. What if Elfric was Byleth's father, and Geralt was the admirer of Citri from afar who, disturbed by what he surmised Rhea was doing, grabbed Byleth and ran off, raising Byleth as his own? 21 years later, Elfric is trying to resurrect his dead wife, and unbeknownst to him, his child with her is trying to stop him. And because Geralt and Rhea both keep their cards close to their vest, neither he nor Byleth find out until late in the campaign. It would still be all about Byleth, but there would certainly be a lot more pathos. My biggest gripe by far with the mechanics of Cindered Shadows should come as no surprise to anyone who watched my playthrough: the lack of movement options. No dance, no warp, no rescue, no stride, no shove, swap, drawback, reposition, nothing other than Yuri's foul play. While this does serve to make Yuri feel special, it's not worth it at the cost of making the player feel incredibly inhibited in their options relative to the main game. I don't mind the restrictions around things like skills and classes. That's classic Fire Emblem, although I'd have happily taken more units with Kanto. But when it comes to movement and positioning, every Fire Emblem title released in the West has much more to work with than Cindered Shadows, whether it's the bevy of options available in Three Houses' main campaign, or things like pair-up and rescue dropping from past games. I find these kinds of options a lot of fun to use, and taking them away makes Cindered Shadows less fun to play in comparison. Worse, it stands in direct comparison to Three Houses' main campaign. As a standalone game, the issue would be less noticeable, because you wouldn't have already spent dozens or hundreds of hours playing with these options only to have them removed. Moreover, the large maps and numerous reinforcements in Cindered Shadows exacerbate this problem, as your units, especially the ones with lower movement, are often left well out of position for dealing with the latest threat. The other mechanical adjustment I take issue with is how supports work. In the main game, all linked attacks provide a hit and avoid boost, even if the characters have no support levels at all. In Cindered Shadows, however, this is not the case, as only characters with an existing support level provide the boost. Leveraging linked attacks is an interesting part of the strategy of the main game, and taking this option away almost entirely for a good chunk of the cast is frustrating, especially given that you can't build up any additional supports, and you start with relatively few of them. Worse, the game doesn't even inform you that the mechanic has changed. I should note that I did not bother to read the guide at the beginning of Cindered Shadows, but having played Three Houses for several hundred hours already, I think I was justified in my belief that it would have nothing new to tell me. It's not close to being the most important mechanic, but changing the way a mechanic like this works, let alone doing so without overt signaling, is bad design. As an aside, if they could change how linked attacks work, why didn't they change the ore drop so that you wouldn't get useless Agarthium and Woot Steel? I do appreciate what the removal of things like tutoring and activity points does for the game's pacing. Optimal use of resources in Three Houses can definitely leave me feeling like I spend far too much time faffing about in the monastery, and far too little time doing battle, and Cindered Shadows thoroughly addresses that problem. The inability to gain weapon ranks at all is a little odd, but it brings the game closer to having the traditional class restrictions on weapons, which I'm completely fine with. A full design review of each chapter in Cindered Shadows would take too much time, so I'm going to just do some quick hits. But first, there's a few overarching points I should discuss. There's no one sweet spot for chapter length in Fire Emblem, but I feel fairly confident saying that no chapter, save perhaps the final chapter, was at or beneath that sweet spot, especially on a first playthrough. The main reason for this, in my opinion, is that chapters in Cindered Shadows consistently have too many enemies. Having a lot of enemies isn't always an issue, but it is if the enemies are tough to kill and or survive against, and if taking them out is required, either due to a route objective, or because taking them out is the only or most reasonable way to achieve whatever the objective is. And without going into too much chapter by chapter detail, every map in Cindered Shadows fulfills these conditions. Furthermore, quite a few of the maps in Cindered Shadows have large numbers of reinforcements. Thankfully they aren't ambush spawns, but given that every chapter requires routing the vast majority of enemies, including most of the reinforcements, this further exacerbates the problem. And reinforcements are especially problematic in this context because unlike enemies that start on the map, the player generally doesn't know that they're coming. This makes the map feel draggier relative to what the player was expecting at the start of the level, and also increases the likelihood that the player is not in position to deal with the new enemies efficiently. As a follow-up to my previous point, I want to re-emphasize something I said during my playthrough. Cindered Shadows would be better with shorter chapters. It feels like the campaign length was padded through sheer enemy volume, causing nearly every chapter to overstay its welcome. Breaking the chapters up so that there are more of them would be a great solution, but even just having a shorter campaign as a result of fewer total enemies would be fine with me. I assume not everyone agrees with me on this, but I'm more concerned with getting a focused, high-quality experience than with an hours per dollar calculation. Three Houses already suffers from heavy map reuse. Given the price and length of Cindered Shadows, I don't think a completely new set of maps would be an unreasonable expectation. Instead, we got 3 brand new maps, one of which is reused within the 7-chapter campaign, 1 map that is a slight variation on a main campaign map, and 2 maps that are taken directly from the main campaign. For me, this is much less of an issue than the enemy quantity and chapter length issues, but it is certainly disappointing. Chapter 1 is the silly excuse for a fight with future friends that's a trope in Fire Emblem. The narrow corridors turn the map into a pseudo-route, and a slow one at that. As with only 2 Kanto units, it's hard to avoid being bottled up. Chapter 2's wide-open arena with elevation changes and avoid tiles is a cool concept and a nice change of pace from Chapter 1. Unfortunately, the map is a bit too big, and the reinforcements last too long, causing the map to drag as everyone scrambles to reach the next wave. Chapter 3 is an absolute slog. The golems are too tough and too numerous. One or the other would have been fine, but both is too much. A second playthrough with knowledge of the true objective location would enable a much faster approach. In my opinion, Chapter 4 has the best concept in the campaign by far. Unfortunately, the second half of the map wrecks the pacing, changing it from a frantic scramble to escape pursuers into a slow grind through a mass of reinforcements. With some tweaks, this could be an outstanding map. Chapter 5 is another big slog of a map that's saved by Happy's ability to summon monsters. Balancing a map like this is very difficult, because if the enemies are too weak or too few, then summoning the monsters doesn't feel impactful. I'm not sure how I feel about the balance they struck. I'd need to play the chapter again, but I do really like the way the monsters affect the strategy. Chapter 6 is Siege Tomes for days. I didn't enjoy how slowly I had to play this one, particularly given that I couldn't use Yuri's foul play to pick off the mages, nor could I even use Constance's rally resistance in the unlikely event I remembered I had the option. Maybe I could have bought pure water in the shop? Regardless, I think a few tweaks to the layout could have made this chapter a lot more fun. Or just give me a stride battalion, damn it. The final boss is appropriately intimidating, but surprisingly manageable, thanks to his self-stun. I like this chapter, and I think it would be pretty fun to replay and figure out how to manipulate the self-stun timing to finish it as quickly as possible. Before I wrap this up, I want to mention that the music in Cindered Shadows, like so much music in Fire Emblem generally, is quite good, and there are a couple of standout tracks that I really hope get incorporated into the main game. So is Cindered Shadows worth it? Honestly, it's probably not worth the $25 price tag, even accounting for whatever value you might get from the other bits of DLC that come with it. The story is pretty nonsensical, and there's minimal additional world building. The characters are probably the best part, but there's already so many good characters in 3 Houses that I don't think you'll miss them if they aren't there. While the gameplay experience is certainly different from the base game, I think the combination of too many enemies and a lack of positioning options make that difference a net negative, especially if you really like spending time in the monastery or customizing your units. And while chapters 4 and 5 could be among 3 Houses' best with better execution, they aren't. I don't regret buying it, and despite its many flaws, I had fun playing it. But if you're on a budget or not a huge Fire Emblem nerd like myself, it's probably better to just stick with the base game, as in my opinion, it's both a better bang for your buck and a better overall experience.